Okay, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure for me to introduce a speaker, which is Paola Scaparra. Paola is a professor of management science at the University of Kent Business School in the United Kingdom. And over the years, Paola held several leadership roles within the school, including Associate Dean of Research and Innovation, Head of the Management Science Group, and Program Director of the MSc Business Analytics. So Paola is passionate about developing OR tools for solving intractable challenges in developing countries and contributing to the achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And also this talk is an example of that. She has led several international multidisciplinary and consultancy projects, including projects funded by the British Academy, the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and Innovate UK. And she's also a member of the General Council of the UK OR Society. So it's really an honor and a pleasure, Paola, to have you here as a speaker. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dick, for the nice introduction. It is actually my pleasure to be here today to share with the ABW community my experience in work in Vietnam and more broadly in Southeast Asia. So in particular today, I would like to talk about two different projects that I've run in the last 5 years. The first project is about enhancing flood resilience in Hanoi, and then the second project is more about really creating and building capacity in analytics and operational research in that part of the world. So before I start with the actual talk, I would like to introduce the team, because this was by no means like just my job. We had a very, very broad interdisciplinary team, including academics at the University of Kent and also a postdoc from the University of Nottingham back then. But mostly we really cooperated with organizations in Vietnam, including IMEN, which is the Institute of Meteorology, Hydrology and Environment, with TDSI, which is part of the Ministry of Transport, with the AMDI, which is the Asian Management and Development Institute, and then with VAST, which is the Vietnamese Academy of Science and Technology. So as I said, every team brought different expertise to work on the first project, which was really an interdisciplinary project. I also need to thank the Global Challenge Research Fund, because this is a program that funded both projects, actually. So it was like a great scheme that was launched in 2016 here in the UK. It was a scheme that involved more or less 1.5 billion research funds. And this was part of the UK's official development assistance. Now, the scheme was really just to fund research in developing countries to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. As I said, it was really successful. It has supported more than 400 partnerships in 85 different countries around the world, starting from very small networking projects to big consortia. And it funded also several projects in analytics, at least here in the UK. Now, unfortunately, in 2001, the program was discontinued. So it's now very, very difficult to find funding to work in developing countries, but there is some hope that maybe at some point it will be brought back. So the first project is titled Optimal Investment Strategies to Minimize Flood Impact on Road Infrastructure Systems in Vietnam. And it was a project in which we were trying to apply optimization to inform investment decisions in mitigation measures in Hanoi to basically mitigate the impacts of floods. So what the problem is in Hanoi is quite clear from these pictures. So there are very frequent floods every year. The frequency and intensity is getting worse year after year. It's predicted also to get worse by 2030. And this causes massive disruption in a city which is already very, very congested. And this is not just a problem which is isolated to Hanoi, but it's a problem that many cities in Vietnam are facing, even in the southern part in the Mekong Delta region. So to introduce the problem even better, I would like to show a quick movie that KMTV, which is a local TV channel here in Kent, promoting the research that we do at the University of Kent, has shot a few years ago. So we'll just play it for a couple
Vietnam,
of minutes.
a land rich with history and culture, it's also one of the fastest growing economies in Asia. Yet the annual monsoon season has wreaked havoc for the Southeast Asian nation, challenging its development and devastating its people. In the last 50 years, more than 5,000 Vietnamese have lost their lives and 25 million have suffered displacement and disruption, making the country the fourth most impacted by flooding in the entire world. Mass urbanisation, ageing drainage systems and climate change have all exacerbated the problem, especially on the country's deteriorating road network. So how to tackle this problem? Working with local authorities, researchers and communities, a team from the Kent Business School has taken a science-driven approach to planning. Using analytical tools including simulations, the team are researching the impacts of flooding on road networks in Vietnam's cities, identifying cost-efficient investments which will lessen the social and economic damage. This pioneering research will now be investigated in 5 other Southeast Asian countries and has the potential to change the lives of millions in the region, and all through the wonderful world of analytics.
So actually the video now is about 3 years old, but according to a recent study that was published on Nature, Vietnam is actually the 3rd country in the world in terms of exposure to floods, with about 45 million people exposed to flooding every year. So the problem was quite complex, and we tried to address it by setting up a project which is composed of 5 different components. So in the first component, we were trying to use a bottom-up approach to understand what were the needs of the local populations, and in particular, what were the perceived impacts of floods in the city of Hanoi. So we ran, with the help of social scientists at AMDI, an assessment of flood impacts. Then we did a review of investment programs. So we wanted to see what the city was planning to do, which kind of interventions they had planned for the next few years. And this was supported by the Minister of Transport together with then the drainage company. Then obviously to be able to estimate the impact of the different projects in the city of Hanoi, we needed to have some kind of predictions in terms of the flood inundations in the city. And for this, Vast and Demand, 2 of the partners, generated flood maps for different flooding scenarios. Now, all the findings of these first 3 components of the project fed into our optimization tool that I will describe in more detail later. So we basically formulated a mathematical model for this, and then we developed also a decision support system for the policymakers and for the end users to use the model. And finally, we gave a practical demonstration applying the tool in Hanoi. So the first component of the project, as I said, was a flood impact assessment. And for this, we conducted some semi-structured interviews in 4 key districts in Hanoi city, which are very frequently affected by floods. We had about 500 respondents, including both residents in the districts, but also visitors. Now, this is very typical in Hanoi. There are many visitors to the city during the day, and these include both street vendors, especially women who come from the rural area every morning to sell their produce, but also taxi drivers, for example. And we tried in the assessment also to consider a gender dimension, because if you look at the literature on disaster management, it's really widely documented that usually women are more affected by disasters, especially flood, more than men. So the 2 main findings of this assessment were about the perceived causes of urban floods. And in this respect, 42% of the respondents highlighted that the aged drainage system was the major cause of floods. And this is due to the fact that Hanoi is a fast-growing city. It went through a process of very fast urbanization, but the drainage system has not been upgraded at the same pace. And it was kind of nice to see that this was reflected also in the perception of the local communities. And then in terms of the economic and social impact, the survey highlighted that the two main concerns of the local populations were the damages to the road and the drainage systems and the traffic congestion. So somehow these were kind of interesting results, because it was interesting to see that local people were putting the damage to the roads and traffic, even they prioritize these issues even compared to the damage to their households, for example, and all the destruction resulting for the flood in the homes. So we try to take this into account when building then our model. So the next step was to review the investment program. And because the first component highlighted that the drainage system was the major concern, we just focused on interventions to the drainage system. So thanks to our partner TDSI and AMDI, we got the drainage system master plan for the years 2030-2050 that contains information about the different projects for Hanoi. Now, these mitigation projects are varied. They include, for example, rehabilitation of lakes. I don't know if you've ever been in Hanoi, but in Hanoi there are many, many lakes in the city, and that's why the city gets flooded very frequently. But other possible mitigation projects were, for example, the construction of new reservoirs or increasing the capacity of existing reservoir, constructing new manholes, and so on. And we could also get information about the costs of these projects, the catchments where this project were supposed to be implemented, and also some structural details. Now, the third component, as I said, was about the production, the generation of the flood maps. And this was like a two-step project. In the first step, the meteorology at VAST generated some rainfall simulation just to simulate like extreme events, rain events in the city of Hanoi. So they use historical data from the big flood that Hanoi had in 2008. And then they generated the rainfall events with respect to two different return periods of 20 and 100 years. So to do this, they use the weather research and forecast model, which is a typical model to simulate rainfalls in a city. Then the predictions about the precipitations were combined with the actual information of the drainage system in Hanoi to generate and simulate the flow of water in the city, which then turned into the flood maps. And for this, we had a team of hydrologists at IMEN who used like a rainfall runoff model, which is called Mike Urban. Again, it's a very typical hydraulic model to generate flood maps and to simulate the water flow by taking into account all the information about the drainage system in the city. So the result of this were some flood maps, as the one that you can see in the pictures for the city of Hanoi, the ones for a 100-year return period flood, and the ones for a flood with a 20-year return period. Now, I have to emphasize that these flood maps were generated both for the base case, which is the ones without any intervention to the drainage system, but then we had to ask IMEN to generate the flood maps also for the different mitigation project, because we were trying to estimate what was the benefit of each project in terms of the reduction of the water level. So this was obviously very time-consuming and resource-consuming, and I will go back to this issue then at the end of the presentation. So then what we did, we set up an optimization model that was aiming at deciding which mitigation project to implement and when over a time horizon of 20 years. Based on the results of our survey, the objectives of the model were to minimize the flood impacts on road congestion and damage, considering different flood scenarios. And then we had a list of constraints. We had a budget constraint in every year. We had constraints to identify which ones were the active combinations of projects in each catchment based on the project selections. And then we had constraints to identify, to really set up what was the impact of projects in terms of road congestion and damage. For inputs, we got obviously the flood maps, we had the list of projects, we knew the cost of the projects, we had information about the catchments, information about the road network, and even the vehicle speed. Now, at the beginning of the project, one of the challenges was a little bit the communication among researchers working in very different disciplines, which was the challenge, but also probably the most rewarding thing about this project. So when we received the flood maps from the hydrologists, we didn't quite know how to incorporate them in our optimization model. But then if you look at them, really behind a flood map, there was a giant spreadsheet with basically the water level for each catchment at a given water depth. So like here, for example, you can see for a given catchment, we knew what was the flooded area, and we knew what was the area flooded at each water level, for example, less than 10 centimeters, all the way to more than 1 meter and 10 centimeters. Now we had to make some simplifying assumptions to model this, and one assumption was that each project had an impact only in the catchment where it was implemented. So a project like building a new reservoir was in a catchment, and the impact of that project in the other catchments was kind of negligible. And this was in fact something that we noticed after the generation of some preliminary flood maps. One complication instead was that if we had more than one project in the same catchment, then the impact in terms of water reduction was not additive. And that was a complication because if we had more than one project in the same catchment, then we had to generate flood maps for each possible combination to evaluate the benefit in terms of water reduction. So we had really to ask IMEND to create all these maps. And in fact, we kind of set up another optimization model to decide what was the minimum number of a simulation of flood map generations to identify the benefits of the projects in each catchment. So we then had to define the objectives. So we had to measure the damage in the catchments and the congestion. Now for the damage, we used a flood depth damage function, which is typical in flood studies. And this function basically gives the damage rate as a function of the flood depth. And we were really lucky because we found a paper published in the International Journal of Geoinformation that had the depth damage function exactly for the city of Hanoi. So this study was using the data in Hanoi. Then for the congestion, we use the BPR function, which is typical in traffic assignment models. And this function gives the congestion rate as based on estimated travel time for different water depths. So this is the free flow travel time on the link at a given water depth, and then they use this formula to have an estimate of the congestion on that link based also on the volume and the capacity. So we were kind of lucky because obviously having the information about the water level and the impacts that each project had on the water level, we could measure the damage and the congestion based on this function. Now, I'm not going to describe the details of the model because it's quite messy. There is a lot of notations, but as you can expect, we have a set of scenarios. Those are the flood scenarios. So in our experiments, there were the 20-year return period, the 100-year return period for the floods. We had a set of water levels. We have the links. We have the catchments. We have the projects. We have all the projects in a given catchment. We have the time periods. And then we kind of had to find a way to keep track of the combinations which were active in each catchment. So of all the projects active in a catchment. So a lot of parameters and data that we needed, but just to summarize, we have the data related to the network, the road network. So we knew the capacity, the length of the links, the volume of traffic, the vehicle speeds for different water levels. And then we had information related to the flood maps. As I said, this was the results of the HIMEN simulations. So we had, for example, what was the predicted flooded area in each catchment and for each water level in each scenario at time 0, or when a given combination of Project Q was implemented. And then we have various other parameters in the model. So again, quite a few decision variables, but the most important ones are the ones defining whether a project was implemented or not in a given time period. So typical binary variable XPT, if project P was implementing a time period T. We had binary variables tracking the active combination. So this variable is 1 if combination Q was active in catchment K at period T. And then we have other variables to capture the flooded area in each catchment and the flooded length of each link in the road network. So again, I'm not going to explain the details of all the variables because I just want to give a sense of the model. So I said before, it's a little bit of a messy model, but the objective was just to minimize a weighted combination of standardized damage and congestion, Z1 and Z2. So we have a set of constraints to compute the damage over all the catchments, depending on which projects were selected. So these 3 constraints just enforce what we have seen before using the damage function. Then we have several other sets of constraints to compute the congestion over all the roads. Again, this based on the active projects and which active combinations was active. So you can recognize here the BPR function for measuring the congestion. We had constraints about the fact that each project can be implemented only once. And then we have quite a few constraints to compute what were the active project combinations, guaranteeing that in each catchment there was only one active combination in each time period. And then we have the budget constraints and the variable domains. Now, as you can tell from the formulation, this mathematical formulation tends to become very big. I mean, the problems tend to become very big because as soon as you start considering a big number of projects, a big number of time periods, and you can have more than the 2 scenarios that we consider, the problem becomes very big. So we had to devise a meta-heuristic to solve the problem. So the meta-heuristic is a multi-star 2-phase hybrid meta-heuristics, where the first phase is a constructive phase based on a very simple greedy randomized adaptive search procedure. And then this was followed by an improvement phase, which is a variable neighbor descent. And for implementing this variable neighbor descent, we used several neighbor structures, which were explored in turn. And these structures were used by 2 different types of moves, some of them acting just on the time periodic changes. So we weren't changing the selected projects, but we were trying to swap the time periods to see if there was an improvement in the schedule of the selected projects. And then we had some standard probability changes where we were trying to swap the selected projects with unselected projects. Now we run these meta-heuristics on several randomly generated instances, but I'm not reporting the results of this in the talk today because I want to focus more on the actual application in Hanoi. So in this application, we consider a time horizon of 20 years. We got 25 potential projects from the master plan of the drainage company. As I mentioned before, we have only 2 flood scenarios, and then we consider 12 water levels, because those were exactly the water levels that were used by the hydrologist to generate the flood maps. Then we use 8 districts of Hanoi. So we had a total of 35 catchments and 377 road segments. And then the Ministry of Transport, our partners at TDSI, gave us the vehicle speeds during flood for 2 different types of roads. So we had roads with a speed limit of 40 kilometers per hour. So this is when there is no flood, so no water. and there are roads with a speed limit of 60 kilometers per hour. And these are the speeds for different water levels. And if the water level is higher than 30 centimeters, then the speed is 0, meaning that actually the cars cannot move if the water is higher than that. Now, we did an analysis considering different budget levels, and we wanted to see what was the reduction, the percentage reduction in both damage and congestion for the different scenarios. So for scenarios with a return period of 100 years or 20 years or both. And this chart represents the reduction in the damage, and this one, the reduction in the congestion. Now, there were several findings from these results, but probably the two key ones are, number one, something that is not displayed in the figure, but is that some of the projects in the master plan had no impact whatsoever on the reduction of congestion and damage. And this is something that the drainage company hadn't considered at the beginning, because obviously they weren't considering the impact on damage and congestion specifically. And the other one, the second finding, is that, as you can see from the chart, with about 20% of the budget, you gain like almost 50% of the total reduction in both congestion and damage. Now, when I say a budget of 100%, this is like the cost of implementing all the projects. Now, to allow the use of the tool by the decision makers and by the policy makers, we also devised a decision support tool, including several different forms. But I just want to show you these last two forms, the catchment and the road forms, because those are the ones that give an idea of the type of results. So these two figures display the damage in the catchments. The one on the left-hand side is the damage before any project is implemented. And here we use a color code where the red areas are the ones with a high level of damage, orange is somewhere in between, and the yellow is slightly lower. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the situation after the implementation of the solution returned by our tool for using a budget of 50% of the total cost of all the projects, and considering a flood scenario with a 100-year return period. So as you can see from the map, there are some areas which were orange before, and then after the implementation of the solution, they become yellow to indicate that there was a drop in the damage. There are also some yellow, some red areas that become orange. So this was just to give the end user like a visualization of the impact of the solutions. And similarly, for the second objective, which was the reduction in congestion, we tried to display this graphic visually. So the blue links, like the dark blue links, are the ones which are heavily congested, and the light blue links are the ones with less congestion. So again, here is the situation before any project is implemented. So as you can see in this district, for example, there are a lot of roads which are heavily congested if there is a flood with a 100-year return period, and some of them are less congested after the project implementation. Same in these links down here, in this part linked in the upper part of the city. Now, there are many different ways in which this model can be kind of extended and adapted. First of all, if the plan is to use the model for different cities in other countries, then additional objectives might need to be considered. So any project really need to be contextualized and need to address the local needs. So for the city of Hanoi, the main objectives were congestion and damage. But for example, we are now considering applying the same tool in Paxi, which is a city in Laos. And in Laos, the main concern is to reduce the impact on water-borne diseases. So they have high rates of water flood diseases that increase during a flood, and that's the main concern. Also, we just consider measures on the drainage system, but actually many other measures could be considered, both structural and non-structural, including, for example, land use, green solutions, waste management, disposals practices, and so on. Our way of modeling congestion, again, was quite basic, but we just wanted to have some kind of guidance. But there are obviously more complex way of modeling congestion in a city, like using traffic equilibrium models and so on. We are also looking about how to incorporate issues like equity and fairness in a better way, to consider, for example, where the poor people live. This somehow can be done by varying the weights that we have to the different catchments, but there might be better ways of doing that. So we are planning to carry out more experimentations in terms of prioritizing catchments, for example, where there are schools or hospitals, critical facilities, and also to carry out additional experiments for different flood scenarios. As I said before, we only considered 2, but we might consider more. We should improve also the visualization. It was quite basic. It would be ideal to link it maybe to Google Maps to make it a little bit more sophisticated. And then the plan, as I mentioned before, is to apply and to build and extend these models to address flood mitigation problems in other cities, in particular in Paksi, in Phnom Penh, in Cambodia, and in Bandung, in Indonesia. Now, going back to the limitations that I mentioned before, the main limitation of this model was the use of the hydraulic models to estimate the benefits of the mitigation measures. Because for each combination of projects in a given catchment, we had to generate the flood maps. And the use of these hydraulic models is time-consuming, is resource-consuming, and it requires the use of very sophisticated models and machines. So this is the reason why, at the end, we could only consider 25 projects, but actually in the master plan, there were more than that. So what we are doing now, we are trying to explore the use of artificial intelligence for predicting inundation levels. And we have just submitted, like a couple of weeks ago, a research proposal for piloting artificial intelligence-driven flood modeling in Hanoi, with the aim then to apply this flood map generation to other problems and to other countries in Southeast Asia. In terms of impacts, we obviously provided the local stakeholders with a flood mitigation tool, which was very well received, but they were hoping to see even more and to go to the next step to consider additional mitigation projects and to consider even mitigation projects which were actually not in the master plan, but just by generating the flood maps, they saw which ones were the hot spots in the city in terms of flood depths, and probably it will be worth to consider some projects which are more tailored to the specific locations. But on top of this, I think one of the main impacts of these projects was to foster partnerships in Vietnam by bringing together these teams that have not cooperated before. And it was very nice to see that this analytical tool was really like a glue that brought together different teams. And after this project, for example, IMEN and the Ministry of Transport started collaborating on different projects as well. It also was useful in terms of promoting the use of operational research and analytics for the Sustainable Development Goals, which ultimately created some kind of momentum for developing more OR kind of culture and environment in Southeast Asia, which then led to the second project that we run in Southeast Asia, which is the CREST OR project. So basically,
maybe Paola,
yes.
Do you prefer the questions afterwards, or maybe already?
Yeah, no, feel free to stop me at any time if there is a
maybe
question.
Also questions for this project, for this first case, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. Are there any questions for Paola?
Let me see in the chat.
You can just use your own microphone, and so there's no need to do it via the chat.
Yes.
Yes, Felix. Yeah.
So I did not really understand, or I would be interested again in the how you mentioned it at the end that as an improvement or an outlook, they would kind of, it would be interesting to get more into details about like creating new project ideas? Did I understand it correctly? Like previously the projects were just where someone looked at it and said this might be a good spot to improve the infrastructure, and then they did it, or was it really based on practical considerations of the practical potential that?
Yeah, no, we approached the drainage company of the city of Hanoi, and they had a list of projects, about 80, 77, I think, at the beginning, but some of them were very incomplete. They didn't have the cost, for example, so all the structural properties, so there weren't enough details to bring them, to include them in the hydraulic model, because in the hydraulic models, they have to go and change the parameters. So for example, if you increase the diameter of a pipeline, then at Iman, they have to go and change all the parameters of the drainage system in Hanoi to consider the larger diameters and regenerate the flood maps considering the flow of water with a bigger diameter. So for some of these projects, we didn't have sufficient details, and then there was the limitation of the flood map generation. So we just look at those 25 projects for which we had all the information. But the researcher at Iman, after they generated the flood maps, they were saying, we would like to suggest actually different projects from the ones that the drainage company has, because actually we saw that this area of Hanoi has much more floods and water level. The water levels are much higher in these scenarios. And they came back to us even last summer to say that actually the predictions and the maps that they generated were pretty accurate, actually based on the latest floods that they had in the city. So in this respect, they were saying it would be nice to consider different projects other than the ones in the initial master plan for the city. So I hope that answers the question.
No, very interesting. I would have more questions, but I think I will keep them for later if there's time. No, thank you.
Great. Thanks. So I don't see other questions, hands on. So please, Paola, can you go to the second case?
Yeah, so the second case, as I said, it was more of a capacity building project. At the end of the previous project, we ran a workshop in Hanoi, and we tried to bring together also practitioners and academics from other countries in the region. So we had participants from Cambodia, Laos, Indonesia, Myanmar. And we used the World Cafe methods to brainstorm with them about what were the main challenges in their countries related to sustainable development. And as a result, we identified problems in 4 main areas: smart cities, so problems related to waste management, and this was common to all the countries participating in this workshop, water distribution and the public transport. There were problems related to the development of transport infrastructure, so problems of congestion, but problems of accessibility through improvement to the rural roads to connect villages to the main cities. Disaster management remains one of the big problems in the region, not only in terms of mitigation, but also in terms of response, especially in Indonesia. And then there were problems related to food security, so food production resiliency, land use, climate shocks, and so on. Sorry, I don't seem to be able. So the Crestoar project, we received funding again through the GCRF to really work on building capacity in analytics and operational research to tackle challenges in these 4 areas that we had identified. So this project was supported also by IFOR and by the UK Operational Research Society, and we have an international advisory board, including Professor Mark Dusky and Professor Elise De Rosario, are probably familiar to this audience. So in terms of the participants, we had participants from 8 different universities in Southeast Asia, so those are the red dots. We had 9 academics from these universities, and then we also recruited 8 early career researchers to start developing the proposals for the identified challenges. And then AMDI was still a partner of this project. Also, this project didn't involve just the University of Kent, but even here in the UK, we had also the University of Lancaster and Southampton as partners. So the objectives of the project were to develop our academic leaders and ECRs. So basically, we wanted to create capacity in OR by developing both academic leaders who could act as ambassadors to promote the use of OR with policymakers, with other academics, to maybe initiate research units or teaching units in their universities. And also we wanted to train early career researchers to have a pipeline of OR researchers. Then we wanted to identify a research agenda, so kind of develop further the challenges in each country that we identified. We wanted to develop a portfolio of research proposals, but ultimately what we wanted to really do, it was to create a sustaining OR community in that country, in the region. So we ran several different activities to achieve these objectives, especially in terms of training. We ran some workshops for the leadership academics, ranging from knowledge exchange and public engagement with research. We trained them in the development of OR curriculum. The OR Society also ran some workshop for them on how to set up an OR Society and what are the main functionalities, events, and so on. And then for the early career researchers, we invited them to attend some of the network courses, which are PhD courses we run here in the UK. They were allowed to attend and audit some analytic courses in our universities, and they had some additional training in grant writing, for example. Then one of the objectives was to create proposals, and working also with academics and practitioners in the different countries, we came out with 5 different projects, which hopefully we'll be able to run in the next few years. So ranging, for example, from inventory control for disaster relief in West Java in Indonesia. I mentioned this project before because there is a lot of interest in flood mitigations also in Laos. Projects about improving and enhancing the multimodal transportation system in Kanto City in Vietnam. And then problems related to forest management and vegetable crops optimization in Cambodia and in Vietnam. Now, one of the achievements of this project was the creation of the Southeast Asia OR Network. So we managed to bring all these academics together, and they set up this network, which is still active now. So they have meetings, and they're trying to apply for more projects, like the one I just mentioned on the use of artificial intelligence, for example, was through this network. And the aim was to increase our knowledge in the region, to have like a platform for collaboration and also for supporting the stakeholders to achieve this sustainable development goals. We also wanted to create a platform to support the establishment of OR societies. And in fact, we are very pleased that at the end of the project, Indonesia submitted an application to IFORS to become an OR society. So they got some corrections to do in the applications, but I think that it should go through hopefully soon. So, and then I just want to terminate with some lessons learned from these projects, which I'm sure are familiar and are very common for all the projects run by ABW. For us, there was a clear need of multidisciplinary approaches. So analytics, as I said, was the glue, but these societal problems, problems related to sustainable development, are so complex that really sometimes they do necessitate multiple disciplines to come together. We are working now, we're trying to work on other projects in Africa, in South Sudan, and in Sierra Leone about ambulance kind of scheduling to reduce the mortality rate, maternal mortality rate. And even there, obviously, we are working with public health experts, with doctors, and with the health providers. So you really need to have a variety of expertise to address these complex challenges. The availability of data is always a big issue. So that's why I'm really pleased that the ABW is trying to tackle this through the PISA initiative, which is really great, because especially in developing countries, the main I would say barrier to the actual implementation of projects is sometimes really the availability of data. It's also important to have genuine and equitable partnerships. So it is true that we can bring our analytics expertise, but you need also the contextual knowledge. You need to understand what are the local needs. you need the NGOs working on the fields to also bring that kind of expertise. It is very important to use bottom-up approaches and make sure that we are really addressing the local needs and not something that we like to work on. So community engagement is really key. It's very important to consider equity and inclusivity. I mean, those are key aspects of all the sustainable development goals, which ultimate aim is really to reduce inequalities and to have a better world for all. And in my experience, one thing that I found really helpful was the use of participatory approaches, like software and soft system methodologies. Now, I know that this is a little bit of a peculiarity of the UK OR landscape. It's probably not something which is really common in other countries, but here in the UK, the use of software as opposed to hardware is really common. And I was a little bit skeptical at the beginning, but then by some colleagues, I've been completely bought into the use of these tools to structure the problems, to engage the stakeholders throughout the full life cycle of the project so that they really feel the ownership of the project. So going from the identification of, for example, the objectives all the way through to the implementation and experimentation. And then capacity building also is a very important thing. It's important to leave a legacy. It's important that they develop their own capacity then to use the tools that we have for other projects. And again, ABW is already doing a great job with the fellowship program. So this is clearly something that is very much needed for this. So thank you for your attention. I think we have still 10 minutes for questions. And if you want to have more information, you can obviously contact me or check the website of the projects.
Thank you very much, Paola, for this very interesting and inspiring presentation. Really very impressive. I'm looking at the audience. Are there any questions? You can use directly your microphone.
Maybe I can stop sharing unless I need to.
Oh, yeah. Perfect. Yeah. Are there any questions?
Hi.
Hi.
Hello. Hi. Very interesting presentation, Paul. Very important topics. You mentioned at the beginning that you were going to look into some of the gender issues as well, and mentioned diversity. So I was wondering whether you could tell us a bit about your experience of trying to use OR and trying to incorporate some of these diversity, equality, and gender issues.
We actually were looking into this because, as I mentioned during the presentation, it's a big issue, especially in Hanoi city, where most of the street vendors are women, and they have also the burden of cleaning up after a flood. They are responsible for children and the elderly. So when the roads are congested, they can't bring the children to school. So there are a lot of issues. One way of tackling it, yes, we would like to incorporate this more. One way is to look at the demographic of the different districts, for example, in Hanoi, but that's probably not enough. So we are currently really investigating how can we incorporate gender issues in a better way in the mathematical models. And this is something that really, if you apply for funding now, you live here in the UK, so you probably know, all the funders expect like a gender statement already within the applications, because not only in the teams of applicants, but also there must be the projects that need to be at the very bare minimum gender sensitive, but if they're gender transformative, that's even better. So yeah, we are looking to that, as I said, looking at the demography of the catchments is one thing, but I don't know if that really answers the full picture of something more needs to be done.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. I have another question, if I might. I'm not sure if...
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay. Forgot now. No, yes, I remember. So it was quite interesting to see the results that you said, sort of what 20-30% of the budget, or well, what I understood to be 20% of the projects get you a lot of the benefits. So how well was this received by decision makers and politicians and
Yeah, no, it was.
Because I can imagine they say,
Yeah,
well,
no, it was.
not happening.
Yeah, it was very well received, but as I said, that they wanted more. They wanted more projects and more. More insights, also in terms of adding some projects that were not there. And especially they were interested in applying the same model in the Mekong Delta region in Vietnam, because that's really the core of their economy. And as you can imagine, being in the Delta region, they have floods very frequently. So there was a lot of interest. They invited us to go back, but unfortunately, as you know, with the cut in the ODF funding, it is very difficult to run projects there. But yeah, we are continuously applying for more.
Thank you very much. That's a really good project.
Any more questions?
May I ask a small one to Paola?
Sì, ciao Fabio.
Okay, ciao Paola. Thank you. Listening to your presentation is always so nice, so stimulating. So thank you very much for the nice presentation.
Thanks.
And interesting problems. And I was just wondering about the project on flood. If there is no some danger of some kind of brass paradox in which you improve traffic and congestion on a road, but the overall congestion might be worse than before the improvement. So this kind of improvements are local to a part of the city, but they decreased congestion in some part might cause a diversion of traffic, which causes problems, maybe even worse than before in other parts. So I know you can do this by incorporating some equilibrium models, which takes into account all of this. But I was wondering whether it could be possible just to extend a little bit the notion of impact to origin-destination pairs, for example, so to paths instead of single roads. I don't know if it is anyway feasible or reasonable.
Yeah, no, you're perfectly correct. In fact, trying to deal with congestion is very, very difficult. I mean, the models, they become very complicated, non-linear, and not something that is easily tractable, especially when they're part of a bigger model, which is already complicated. So yes, we could consider connectivity instead of considering congestion. Yeah, accessibility to key facilities, certainly. We started with congestion because that's what emerged from the survey, and we were trying really to address what were the concerns of the local population. Yeah, but even in disaster management literature, you look first at a slightly more simple model. You look at connectivity, accessibility, yeah, shortest paths. Yeah, it's a good suggestion. We should definitely look into that. Even to see if the recommendations are the same or if they change consistently.
By the way, the linear model is already so complex that adding nonlinearity doesn't make it much worse.
Thanks. Are there more questions?
Yes, I have one general one.
Yes.
Hi, Paola. Thank you.
Hello, hi.
Wonderful talk. It was really motivating. And regarding the first part, I have a general question. Are you still open to new collaboration in that project? If so, in which particular lines do you think we can somehow collaborate?
I think that there is always space for collaborations. So because we are trying to apply this model in different cities. And I was saying that the problems that the different cities have are completely different. So from waterborne diseases in Paxi In Indonesia, for example, they're much more concerned about food supply, so like the impact of floods on the food supply chains. So we need to build models which are completely different. We would like to have like a range, like a portfolio of different models that can be applied in the different situations. And need for data scientists, for sure. I'm more of an optimization person. I'm not as good when it comes to data science, but I rely now on the colleagues in Vietnam who are proposing to use artificial intelligence, for example, to produce these flood maps. So use like topological data, geoscience data, and land use data to see whether it's possible to predict the floods without resorting to these very complex hydraulic models. So yeah, if you're interested in developing models in the previous part of data collection, flood map generations, I'm open. And I was saying that it would be nice to have funding, because the problem we had in Vietnam was to pay for the people to generate the flood maps, because they have to use the machines in these departments, which are very highly sought after. So it's we couldn't just go there and say, okay, run all this simulation, produce all these flood maps for me. Or but if we find an alternative, then a lot of the research can be done also without the need of funding.
Okay, thank you, and congratulations again.
Thank you.
And then I think there's one question, although the time is already, it's almost, here it is 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the Netherlands. So time for the last question from Yusufu, if I pronounce it correctly.
Yes, that's correct, Yusufu. Thank you, and hello to all. Unfortunately, I didn't make it soon. Ali from the
we can't hear you, so the connection is very bad. No, I think that is not, we can't hear you, so sorry. So maybe you can then write an email to Paola.
Yes, certainly. You can write me a message.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we cannot hear you.
No.
I think we have lost him now.
Yeah, so I think it's time now. So again, thanks, many thanks, Paola, for this very inspiring and nice talk. I also have some questions, but I will also contact you later.
Okay. No, thanks for the invitation. It was really great to share my experience, and thanks for attending today.
Yeah, and I was also very inspired by the community, the capacity building that you were doing there. And yeah, I also see some more tasks there maybe, or some that from ABW we can contribute there. So
in fact, it would be really lovely to connect the Southeast Asia OR network, because they're very keen. Now that they got together, they want more projects, and I think it would be lovely. They can connect with the ABW and maybe participate next year in the fellowship program.
Perfect, thanks. So thanks all of you who participated in this webinar. So the information for the next ABW webinar will be sent to you, and also the recording of this talks. There were several questions about that in the chat, but those will be sent to you later via an email. Thanks a lot, and see you also next time.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.